and fun to talk about this topic. Um, if you have trouble seeing the slides or you can't hear me or whatever, please let Dr. Zhang know and we'll try and fix it. But right now I'm seeing everybody following along, and I'll assume that my voice is beaming out into wherever you are. So we'll just roll with it. I got involved with megaregions well, mostly through regional planning. In the early days of the whole megaregion, the idea, or actually the more modern phase of it, because it goes back some ways, we first began referring to these things as super cities. You know, the idea being that these kind of networked systems of metropolitan areas really were beginning to describe simply much larger cities and metro areas than we had. And the term megaregion kind of evolved as the work evolved. But the thing that always kind of I found interesting about the whole topic was, again, the opportunity to think about planning where instead of matching the issues to institutions whose boundaries don't approximate the issues very well, that we could maybe start with geography that made more sense, that could potentially in some ways better approximate the systems we were looking at. And I think that's a really elusive goal. It's really hard to do. It's even hard to do with megaregions or regions for that matter. For those of you who've looked at the history of, for example, metropolitan regionalism in North America, Toronto was the absolute model for metropolitan regionalism after the early 1950s, when Metro Toronto was formed, and what had been 34 cities were combined into 6, and it was really built into a brand new institutional form. But by the 70s, the amount of sprawl outside of Metro Toronto put the province at a crossroads. It had to decide, would it expand the boundaries of Metro Toronto to take in this new larger area and geography of urban and metropolitan issues, or what? And what they finally decided to do in about 1973 was that instead of making the boundaries of Metro Toronto larger to match the geography of the urban issues at the time, they created 4 new regions around the region of Metro Toronto. And so what had been really the model for North American regionalism after World War II became instead, a kind of a typical model of large institutions, none of whose boundaries matched the geography of the issues particularly well, taking each other on. And so we have this problem. This happens kind of over and over again. This is not new. Incidentally, for those of you who are keeping score, this also is a characteristic of universities. Only universities describe the world in terms of disciplines. The world is kind of more synthetic than that. And similarly, so are urban issues and metropolitan problems. Okay, this first slide is a picture of North America at night, and to underscore that, when we start to look at the urban places that have been built, the notions of boundaries become a lot vaguer, harder to pin down. This is kind of the image that in many ways launched what became the America 2050 project and has led to a lot of the most recent work on megaregions. But it really does kind of begin to raise the question of, what makes a region? And for the purposes of this talk, I'd like you to think about regions as places that have relatively clear centers and fuzzy edges. In other words, regions are characterized by a wide range of factors that overlap in a place, but where those factors feather out to in the far reaches of these territories becomes much less distinct. So, regions are easiest to identify at the center, hardest to identify or distinguish at the edge. And ideally, again, when it comes to regions, it would be nice if the scale of the region matched the scale of the systems that the planning was attempting to intervene in. It doesn't always turn out that way. Okay, let's see if I can change the slide here. I'm trying that, that's not working. Hold on, everybody. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, Cascadia. So the region I'm going to talk about today, Cascadia, this is kind of, the apocryphal image for Cascadia. There's fish swimming in the river. There's a river that comes from the mountains. There's mountains covered with snow and lots of big trees. It's the product of some complex geotechnical seismic forces that have created this landscape. And because of where we are on the edge of the Pacific Rim, the edge of the Pacific Ocean, this has been a phenomenally abundant place for people to live for over 14,000 years. In fact, I'm speaking to you today from a territory that's one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in North America. A record of about 14,000 years of continuous human inhabitation, the ancestral home of a number of tribes that figured out how to use this place to their advantage, and that we now benefit from tremendously. And it's kind of an amazing place in that it's a very abundant landscape. There's a lot of resources here that make it possible to live a good life. And that's been true for a very long time. In terms of ecoregions, another kind of description of kind of where we are. This is us in the green on the west coast of the United States. Here's Texas down here for those of you who are watching this from Texas today. And you can kind of see the way in which this green territory kind of feathers in and out. There's a major mountain range here, the Cascade Mountains. And one of the key questions that has arisen for a long time about how to define Cascadia is, where does it begin and end? Is it Western Oregon kind of idea, Western Washington, Western British Columbia, or does it extend further into the inland? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a kind of a map of tribal groups. And I think one of the things that's really interesting when you start to look at this history in Cascadia is that we have different language groups separated often by really short distances, which is another kind of way of saying that people who lived here for thousands of years didn't have to go very far to secure the things they needed to live a good life. And this is a kind of a food tradition kind of map, again, echoing that same kind of derivation of region up here in the upper left edge that we call Cascadia. This is a more modern map of Cascadia, and I'll show a couple more of these. But again, it's coastal, but it also extends into the inland portions of the Pacific Northwest, largely following the river basins of the Columbia and Snake Rivers and the Fraser River in Canada, the Yukon River in Canada. These are, this area is often referred to as the Northwest Temperate Rainforest, Pacific Northwest Temperate Rainforest. Again, a very abundant landscape for people. Interestingly, the whole question of where the Pacific Northwest was from a national point of view didn't get settled real quickly. It wasn't, in fact, until the British and the Americans settled on the 49th parallel as the northern boundary of the country that we actually kind of knew where Oregon, what would become Oregon and Washington and Idaho would actually end. This is a map kind of showing that boundary evolution over time. And I should say that Professor Zhang has all of these slides, and you can get them from him. Glad to have you use them however you'd like. This particular set of maps is kind of really interesting and brings us into kind of, I think, this, or close to this modern era of looking at Cascadia and Pacific Northwest regionalism. This is work done by the National Resources Administration back during the 30s. It was one of the Great Depression institutions that was created at a time when, you know, the economy in the nation had really fallen apart, and the question had become what could be done to not just rebuild the economy, but rebuild the nation. And so the question that they were asking was, well, what are the territories that we ought to be looking at? How ought we to define the planning territories that we would use to guide investment and intervention to try and remake the country in the wake of the Great Depression. This, of course, was all pre-digital tools. This was all done by hand. These are 4 maps, but there are hundreds, maybe thousands of these maps of different factors that were put together in a wide variety of ways. For those of you who are interested, there's a very interesting book that was published in 1938, which I know is a long time ago, but for those of you who are kind of geeks when it comes to regions and regional planning, this is something you should look at. It's called American Regionalism, and the author is Howard Washington Odum, O-D-U-M, and kind of goes through this history of defining different territories across the United States for purposes of creating planning regions. And after looking at a lot of different problems and factors and systems, this is kind of what they came up with. And it's interesting to look at this map, which comes from about 1936 to 1938, and to see here is, you know, Cascadia, the Pacific Northwest region. Actually, for those of you who read, you know, kind of utopian fiction, Ecotopia, which was written by Ernest Kallenbach and published in the 70s, pretty much used this territory from Northern California up to the Canadian border. And of course, you know, only a nation would make a map where anything to the north or the south of the nation kind of appears as, you know, snow-covered glacial remnants. In other words, places with no detail at all, despite the fact that, of course, all of these factors that went into creating these regions extend well beyond the boundaries of the United States itself. But when you look at this and you begin to kind of think about the mega regions, and I understand there's been a series of presentations, some of you have maybe done some work or some reading about mega regions, that you begin to see kind of the territories in many ways that we're talking about today. You know, California, northern and southern, the Intermountain region, which is now kind of getting divided up in a number of ways, but we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. The Great Plains, the Great Lakes, there are a lot of things. The one thing that's kind of missing here, which I think is kind of interesting, well, it's not entirely missing, but kind of the granddaddy of them all, which is Gene Gottman's megalopolis, which was Gene Gottman was a geographer who identified this area of continuous urbanization on the East Coast from approximately Boston down to Richmond, Virginia, which really gave rise to thinking about these large new territories of urbanization that were growing in this country, and which, you know, in many ways provides the model for thinking about what we call megaregions today. So Cascadia, you know, tall trees, snow-covered mountains, jumping fish. It's kind of how we were thought about. This is another map that was made by the National Resources Administration back in the 30s. It's kind of the placemat view of the United States. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the biases in this map. The only place where ships come to the United States is apparently on the East Coast. The only places where things are made on the East Coast or in the United States are apparently in the kind of Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New England kind of locations. The only thing that you'd look to the west for, and particularly the Pacific Northwest, is for natural resources. It's kind of a portrayal of the nation as this kind of pipeline of resources to the east and from the east to the world. It's a very strong political and cultural statement about what people expected these relationships to amount to at that point in time. And we'll come back to that. In the Pacific Northwest, this is the Columbia and Snake River watersheds, which became particularly of interest to the nation during the 30s with the construction of the Grand Coulee and Bonneville dams, the electrification, which led to, was presumed to lead to a tremendous amount of new prosperity as new industries began to locate in the Pacific Northwest. And which in fact in time have really helped to secure for the Pacific Northwest a kind of an energy future based on cheap electricity that's been particularly important. What's also interesting about this, though, is again the way that it echoes not only the landscape, but the traditional cultures that lived here for thousands of years before anyone came across anything called the Oregon Trail in the mid-19th century. And some of the, at least from what we know, some of these tribes along the Columbia River, particularly in this area, engaged in the salmon trade, were some of the wealthiest tribes in North America at that time. In the 70s, this kind of notion of reassembling the characteristics that make North America into a variety of different alternatives kind of came back. And Joel Garreau wrote a book called 9 Nations of North America, where he identified again Ecotopia from southeastern Alaska down to Northern California as kind of one of his 9 nations. These were kind of cultural expressions. The idea was that you could begin to kind of see how the US was sorting and North America was sorting into a variety of assemblages. Colin Woodard did the same thing more recently, and you get kind of a similar kind of thing. I mean, Cascadia kind of shows up. It's more lumped in his derivation with coastal California and the politics really of the coasts. But it's the same basic kind of idea, kind of a derivation of regions in North America. And then Cascadia, and David McCloskey is probably the person who's worked, I'd say, on this Cascadia idea longer than anyone else, and has popularized the notion of Cascadia that we're talking about today. Over time, people interested in Cascadia have come up with flags, have come up with stamps. The notion is that Cascadia could maybe someday emerge as some kind of territory unto its own, as maybe something with some kind of self-governance apart from national institutions for governance. It's a utopian idea by some. But it turns out that, this kind of notion of Cascadia and of the rearrangement of our understanding of how the nation and the continent is assembled and governed, it's getting a lot of attention in a lot of places. Ecotrust is an environmental organization which started a campaign for something they call Salmon Nation, which basically, again, goes from Northern California up to southeastern Alaska, and looks at the existing and historic range over which salmon lived and spawned in the Pacific Northwest. All of this is to say that there's a lot of consistency in the way in which the Northwest gets separated out from the nation. A lot of it has to do with landscape. A lot of it has to do with environment, and it has really deep roots that go back literally tens of thousands of years. Now, there's two ways of thinking about regions, of course. One is, the notion of what separates a place from other places. What separates Cascadia from the rest of the United States? What separates New England from the South? What separates the South from Texas? All those kinds of things. There are this kind of ways of thinking about how places are distinct and separate. And that's clearly a way that we've thought about regions for a long time. The other way to think about regions, though, is what do regions contribute to the whole? In other words, what does Cascadia add to the United States? What does New England add to the United States? What does the South contribute to the United States? It's the flip side of the same coin in some ways, but it really begins to raise the question of what is the purpose to which we are putting this notion of region or this notion of mega region to work. What are we trying to accomplish by referring to it? So America 2050 comes along and begins to look at mega regions in the United States. Again, first referred to as super cities, very urban, later mega regions, I think reflecting the idea that, well, maybe there's non-urban parts of these territories that are going to get included, and we ought to be thinking more broadly about that. And I would say that this effort in particular, America 2050, in many ways is emblematic of this notion of what is it that mega regions can mean for the nation, because underlying the mega regional interest with America 2050 was the notion of affecting national policy. Okay, this was very much about a political strategy for how to get the nation engaged, particularly in infrastructure investments. I mean, when you get right down to it, when you boil it down, there's not a lot of romance in the mega regional kind of movement, so to speak. It's kind of nuts and bolts. It's kind of a bricks and mortar kind of notion. Mega regions, according to the analysis that's been done, are projected as the location for over 70% of the regions or of the nation's population by 2050, over 70% of the nation's economic activity by 2050. I mean, these are clearly territories which are going to have a huge impact on the prosperity of the nation as measured, and this is important, as measured by the way in which we assess the prosperity of the nation. So, the idea was, in many ways, to create a compelling case for a new generation of investment on the part of the nation in the territories that were likely to be most important in the nation's prosperity in the decades ahead. Now, that's a particular set of interests. That assumes that you can begin to kind of lump these regions together. You can begin to look to these regions as all having kind of a similar impact on the nation, a similar impact from the nation on them through the kinds of investments and policies that get created. But it raises, I think, a really important question for all of us interested in this topic, which is, why should megaregions matter? What is it that we're looking for when we look at this concept? And this is not a trivial question. I can think of a couple of reasons why they should matter, but whether or not they do for these reasons, of course, remains to be seen. One is that there's a regional or national purpose to be served by identifying as a mega region. So, for example, if the challenge is to get major investment in transportation infrastructure in the Northeast, in megalopolis, in this corridor from Richmond up to Boston, that means convincing Congress that there needs to be some greater national investment because the requirements are multi-state and they're high. But convincing Congress means finding a reason why people in these other areas ought to care about investing in the Northeast megaregion. And so in many ways, what looking at megaregions as a statistical derivation of the United States is about, at least in part, is creating that national purpose. Now, we've done this before. There's been some work, not a lot actually, on the history of national planning in the United States. And there hasn't been a lot of work on national planning in the United States because frankly, the United States has not done a lot of national planning. It's really not part of our DNA in quite the way it is in other places. But there have been times when the nation has made profound investments in infrastructure. You can think of the interstate highway system. You can think about the Gallatin plan for turnpikes and canals, basically. You can think about even the work that was done during the Great Depression by the National Resources Administration and others as moments in history when the United States has kind of thought in terms of a national scale of action and investment. Doesn't happen very often, and it doesn't last very long, because in the United States, we're not that comfortable with national scale investment, or at least we're not very comfortable with national scale investment that's directed by the nation. We're much more comfortable with essentially the transfer of funds, if at all, to states and to localities to make their own decisions about how to spend that kind of money. So why should megaregions matter? Because there's a regional or national purpose. And I think if you look at any megaregion, and we're going to be looking a little bit more at Ecolopolis, at Cascadia in a second, but whether it's the Texas Triangle or the Arizona Sun Corridor or megalopolis in the Northeast, I think the real question becomes, what is the regional or national purpose to be served by identifying these geographies as being real in some sense? Now, of course, another reason why megaregions should matter would be because it could yield better planning. And again, there is this long-standing mismatch between the scale of systems in the United States and the scale of the institutions we've created to address those systems. So you could make the argument that megaregions could yield better planning if, in fact, what we were doing is better matching the systems that we're trying to intervene in, or intervening in any case, to institutions or jurisdictions that make more sense, that better match those issues. Maybe, I think the question remains, at what point have we created boundaries for these megaregions that lead to better planning? Or to what degree have we created boundaries, in fact, that in many cases create maybe even worse planning? One of the places that strikes me as raising that question in a profound way is the Great Lakes megaregion. Because to identify a megaregion with a series of lakes, I think speaks directly to the need to identify the watersheds for those lakes as being particularly important. But as you'll see, if you dig into the megaregion literature, almost all of it leaves Canada out. Almost all of it leaves the Canadian side of these lakes out of the equation. And so I think it raises the question yet again, are these megaregions leading to better planning? They should, maybe they could, it would be nice. And then finally, I guess the question becomes, does the use of megaregions lead to better outcomes? And this raises a profound institutional question. because to get a better outcome, you've got to begin to cure some of the problems we have with existing institutions. Now, many of the institutions that we charge with dealing with the kinds of issues associated with infrastructure, even with housing and other kinds of urban issues that we're dealing with today, were created a long time ago, before any of the kind of technologies or issues that we're dealing with today were really thought of in quite the same way that we're dealing with them now. If you look at the Constitution or state constitutions, which is another kind of rabbit hole to go down, you know, what you discover is that states and cities and counties tend to have a place in these constitutions, tend to have been delegated powers to do stuff. But regions, no, not so much. In fact, regions don't get the same kind of place at the table. And so getting regional outcomes, I think, really begs the question in many ways of regional institutional design. So if we're going to make megaregions matter, some kind of regional or national purpose would be helpful. Expecting better planning to come of it would be useful. But I think better planning also means we need to be kind of really smarter about how we understand space and place in the context of the planning we're doing. And finally, better outcomes really begs the question of institutional reform, or the evolution of governing institutions that we've relied on for a very long time. And that is a very thorny problem. All that to say that should mega regions matter? Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons to think that they should, but we ought to be really careful about it, because it's an uphill battle in many cases with making them work. Okay, so, okay, America 2050. Let's kind of move on back to megalopolis. Gene Gottman identifies megalopolis as an area of continuous urbanization, and even begins to identify not just the area on the East Coast as megalopolis, but the possibility of the emergence of additional megalopoli in the future as more work gets done and as development continues. This is a kind of a map that shows population by census tract in the Northeast. This is Boston kind of on the right side of the image, and Richmond down here on the left side of the image. And, you know, again, the notion is that what has evolved is an area of continuous urbanization, which, for those of you who've driven through this corridor, you know, you realize it's not exactly, you know, kind of Manhattan all the way from Boston to Richmond, but the kind of territory is very finely divided institutionally, and relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the nation, relatively well settled. So when you come to Cascadia, what becomes conspicuous, at least on the US side of the border here, is that you've got the Seattle metropolitan area kind of towards the upper center. You've got Portland down here in the kind of towards the lower right on the Columbia River. But you have a lot of spaces in between. Toggle back and forth. And similar concentrations around major cities, but when you get right down to it, it's a different kind of landscape. So Cascadia, an abundant place, an administrative region, a bioregion. It's a brand. And most of the livability efforts in this region, whether they're in Oregon or Washington or British Columbia, are directed at preserving what this region had to offer originally. Clean water, clean air, access to the wilderness, and so forth. So in doing our work on the Cascadian megaregion, we began to kind of ask this question, well, what are we really trying to become? What is it that this region is all about? What speaks most loudly? We did a bunch of work looking at migration. We looked at the economy of Cascadia. We looked at clusters in the major metropolitan areas of Cascadia. You know, what we discovered was that it wasn't, in fact, the case that adjacency mattered that much. Simply put, we didn't find a lot of magic in the fact that these metropolitan areas are relatively adjacent to each other. The economic footprint, for example, of Portland, Oregon, looks more like the economic footprint of Austin, Texas, than it does Seattle, Washington. Yeah, Seattle has high tech, we have high tech, but our high tech looks more like Austin's high tech. Seattle's high tech looks more like San Jose's high tech. British Columbia's high tech looks more like LA's high tech. And Vancouver, BC is a completely different story in a lot of other ways, because from a national point of view, Vancouver is the only major city in Canada that doesn't freeze in the winter. It's the Miami Beach of Canada. It's the Western port of entry of Canada. It's the Hollywood of Canada. I mean, it's a very different kind of animal, despite the fact that it's in the same landscape as Seattle and Portland. So if it's not, you know, migration, if it's not the economy, what ties this mega region together? And what we kind of settled on over a series of years and doing some kind of variety of reports is that we decided that it really had most to do with, again, the landscape, with the brand of Cascadia, with the idea that we didn't want to be megalopolis. We didn't want to be a continuous strip of urbanization from Vancouver, BC down to Portland or south of Portland. The idea being that we wanted to emerge as kind of something different. And so we coined the term Ecolopolis just for fun as a way of distinguishing Cascadia from the kind of Northeast corridor or megalopolis, as Gottman called it. Because where we're heading, we hope, is not to the same place that maybe the Northeast corridor is heading. Now, there's an interesting kind of notion here, which is opened up by thinking in this way, and that is that the identity of each of these megaregions, the authentic nature of what these places are all about, can and probably is really can be and really is different. In other words, looking at the nation and regarding all of those blobs on the map as being essentially part of a national enterprise of some sort is a huge leap, unless it's not just about the investment in infrastructure. High-speed rail alone does not create consistent national purpose within all of these regions. All of these regions actually have their own particular reasons for being and their own aspirations for where they want to go. And so that's kind of why we coined the term Ecolopolis, because we wanted to underscore the idea that there's a potentially different identity operating here, or at least a specific identity that needs to be served by whether it's a regional agenda or a national agenda. And interestingly, you know, again, I don't think any of these mega regions would think of themselves as defined particularly well by their aspirations for infrastructure. I mean, what makes New York great, right? That it has subways, or that you can find anything there, you know, or you can be anything you want. I mean, I think we need to be a little careful about how we, again, define these mega regions, or at least how we understand whether we're speaking to regional or national or both kinds of purposes. It's not entirely clear, at least in the work that's been done to date. So we came up with this notion of an ecolopolis as a way of kind of playing with it. We did a number of different reports, all of which are available on the internet. I've got a URL at the end of this presentation. So if any of you who are interested in kind of reading up on kind of, following our breadcrumbs through this trail of projects, are certainly more than welcome to go back and see what we came up with. But what else did we discover? Well, most leaders are intensely focused on what it is they got elected to do, back to the observation that regions don't appear in any constitution. In essence, we have leaders who from time to time will talk a regional talk, but what it really kind of boils down to is they got elected to represent local concerns and to act on them. And we've found no clear evidence that, for example, leaders in Portland would alter their thinking about Cascadian investment based on needs in Seattle. Should that arise, then leaders in Seattle would think that they needed to care particularly about what was happening in Portland. The reward system just doesn't respond well to this notion of operating at a regional or mega-regional scale. And again, largely it's because of the historical inertia behind the institutions that we already have. Okay, and I guess the other thing to kind of underscore is that again, there's no magic in adjacency. Got to be careful with that one. The other is that identity swings both ways. We have white supremacists who've seized on Cascadia as a way to describe their future. Northwest Front, our race is our nation. It's a chilling kind of, addition to the Cascadian, kind of legacy. And then on the same token, Cascadia and the Doug Fir flag have become emblems of the left and the far left in Cascadia. And so, this kind of notion of appealing to identity based on place is a tricky topic. I would urge you to be careful with it. Make no mistake, this is not just a Cascadian kind of notion. This is a map of active separatist movements in North America. There's even some that I don't think are on here, but could be. But point being that, appealing to identity based on place, just as appealing to identity based on any other characteristic, is not necessarily a progressive notion. Okay, if we wanted to pursue this notion of an ecolopolis, what could we do? What could our strategies kind of look like? And we thought there might be about 4 things that would be really useful to do. The first is to really look at the cities and the metro areas of Cascadia as a laboratory for innovating for sustainability and resilience. Again, we live in a very seismically active zone. We're expecting a major earthquake kind of at any moment. And how we prepare for that, how we bounce back from that, will be crucial tests of our ability to, of our planning, of our ability to respond, of our commitment to each other. Beyond that, this kind of notion of growth management and sprawl is really, an idea that's relatively advanced in the Pacific Northwest, in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver. And there are still some really amazing things happening. Interesting work on transit in Seattle, for example, which is expanding the bus system by leaps and bounds. Interesting work on reforming zoning in Portland and Vancouver. So there's good work going on, but good work remains to be done. And finally, climate. We continue to take the easy way out on things like transportation investments. We know that at least 40% of the carbon emissions, for example, in the Portland area come from transportation. But yet Metro, which came, which is the, I don't know, it's done some amazing work on regional growth management, was proposing a set of investments in transportation infrastructure that would have yielded no change in carbon emissions from the transportation system. When they took that to the ballot, the public rejected it, not necessarily because the public was outraged at no action on climate change, but probably because the public was a little kind of worried about the total cost of what was being proposed at the time. But all that to say that we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do, and we haven't figured out all the things we need to figure out, but that these cities are poised and have a history of innovative work on behalf of sustainability and resilience, and we need to do more. We could do more, and it could be a kind of a Cascadian theme. Pictures of the three cities. They all tend to have, water, snow-covered mountains and trees, pretty typical views. Okay, second strategy. We don't want to become an area of continuous urbanization. Okay, fine. That means we need to come up with some ways of ensuring that there is a viable, two things, a viable economy in the natural resource zones surrounding our cities. And second, strong connections between what those zones produce and what gets consumed and developed within the cities themselves. We've got to do more to save agriculture, forests, and fisheries. We're scratching the surface. We're beginning to see more buildings built out of timber in a variety of forms. We know that the forests in these places could have a lot to do with sequestering carbon on behalf of the planet. We could be doing a lot more than we are with that theme. But again, this is one that really applies throughout Cascadia and works well with the notion of an ecolopolis. The third, we do need to make some linkages in the economy. We haven't done that in a particularly conscious way. There is a new effort called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor that's being explored largely through tech interests, Microsoft in particular, and I'd say largely with an interest in hedging their bets and having kind of a stronger, easier connection between Canada and the US. It's more about global capital than it is necessarily about Cascadia. But I think there are things we could do to kind of build on that. And then finally, we should be thinking about, and again, for whether it's climate reasons or a variety of other ways, the ways in which people can inhabit Cascadia as pedestrians. I mean, this is a pretty amazing place. Again, from where I'm sitting in the city of Portland, in 45 minutes, I can be in a wilderness. I can take a day trip to the wilderness. I can almost get there by transit, not quite, but almost. We can be thinking about, I think, a lot of ways in which the things that we do could be organized and linked in new and, again, innovative ways. So this is the links to me and to the Ecolopolis reports. Have at it. Let me know if there's anything I can do, but I think we've got some time now for questions. I guess the last thing I would say in conclusion to all this is that there's, megaregions themselves aren't magic. If there is magic in megaregions, it's going to be because we come up with good purposes to which we want to turn them. We have so far to date not done a particularly good job of that in my estimation, but we can talk more about that in the questions and answers if you'd like. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Seltzer, for offering your very unique perspective, the lens through mainly through the eco-region, eco-environment, and culture aspect in the context of megaregion discussion. So in terms of the reports, yes, I have already downloaded all those versions, except version number 1. I provide, well, not all in the audience, those in my class, versions 2 through 5. So later I will go to that link and then find the version number 1. Right, and now the floor is open. Zoom window is open, so anyone would like to jump in, offering your comments or asking questions. Well, I guess we need, once we have 1 or 2 people start talking, then others will will jump in. Then in that case, then I will start then. And the question about this livability or the cost of living, very challenging now, facing major metropolitan area like Boston and on the West Coast, right? Seattle or several other cities in the Cascadia area. It's also on the top list in terms of affordability. So could you elaborate on that based on your research, whether or not this way of a very strong growth control contribute to some extent the high living costs in the area, not necessarily in every city in the Cascadian area, of course, but like Seattle, Vancouver, and others are known to be very expensive. So eventually may hurt people, the workforce and the business as well. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah. Well, that's almost a whole different topic, and a very interesting one. And I guess the costs and benefits of growth have always been kind of a challenge for planning in general. Who bears the cost, who receives the benefits, and the costs and benefits of growth management. There's all kinds of work that's been done on, for example, the impact of urban growth boundaries on housing prices. And generally speaking, urban growth boundaries don't have much of an impact at all on housing prices. The thing that really seems to affect housing prices are 2 things. Number 1, the demand for housing. And number 2, the degree to which it is difficult or not to add housing to the existing housing supply. Keep in mind that suburbanization appeared to be very cheap when the federal government was putting a lot of money into infrastructure and housing directly. And that as the federal government withdrew its investment in essentially the development of new land, new suburban development opportunities, the cost of housing in suburbs began to rise pretty dramatically. And as the life of that infrastructure comes to an end, I think we will see kind of a leveling of costs throughout metropolitan areas in a lot of ways. There's simply going to be no cheap areas unless, number 1, we make a kind of a commitment to continue to invest in the infrastructure needed to support households particularly, and second, begin to alleviate or remove the barriers to the construction of new housing that we've put in place in most cities in the United States. As far as demand goes, yeah, I mean, when demand drops, prices drop. And, we'll see kind of, I think, post-COVID, some interesting adjustments in real estate markets as what seemed to be the inexorable rise of cost in some places maybe begins to cool to some degree. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to the presentation, this is an area that has been for 14,000 years a really good place for people to live and remains that way. And so I suspect that, the coping with the kind of the results of being a desirable place will remain a problem for Cascadia for a while.
So if I may interpret that way, that the housing affordability from household perspective mostly result from local land use control, which leads to housing supply shortage or rental market or others, rather than this larger regional perspective. Regional
I mean, for example, the Portland region has always been a region of newcomers. That is, when you look at the Portland region, it's got a very high proportion of people who were not born, who live here, who were not born in the state of Oregon. In fact, it's a higher proportion than you find in Seattle or in Los Angeles or in San Francisco. Not as high as you find in Vancouver, but then again, Vancouver plays a very different national role in many ways. But all that to say that, people are kind of choosing to come here for a variety of reasons. And until those reasons evaporate, there will be upward pressure on housing prices. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Portland City Council essentially enacted zoning reforms that allow by right the construction of up to 4 units on what previously had been reserved for a single unit.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
So could I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so first, thanks so much for the impressive presentation. And I used to live in Seattle, and your presentation just draws me back to the time living there. But I'm still thinking about the possibility of cooperations between different cities. So, Cascadia is not just a kind of regions in the Washington state. It across the Washington state, Oregon, and even the British Columbia. So how could the cities cooperate with each other since they are in different states or even countries? I mean, how the corporations, how this kind of corporations can come true when it's across so many administrative boundaries?
Well, I tell you, I think that is the central question. It's kind of, on one hand, what interest would local residents or elected officials have in seeking cooperation with other cities? To what end would they be seeking that cooperation? Or another way of looking at it is, in what way does that cooperation enable cities to achieve more of the things that they're committed to? And I think those are terrifically difficult questions to answer in the absence of some kind of overarching national purpose or expectation that cooperation not only take place, but yield something tangible as an outcome. I guess what I'm thinking about is the way in which, there have been regional planning efforts throughout the United States. most of them have been set up under the auspices of what are called councils of governments. And councils of governments are legendary for for meeting a lot, to talk about a lot, and then acting kind of hardly at all. In other words, that if you have an entity whose membership basically is composed of people who fundamentally don't want that entity to tell them what to do, at the end of the day, they're not going to agree to do much. And it's one of the interesting things about kind of the history of regionalism in the United States. There are very few examples that you can point to where the regional kind of collaborative or governance effort is able to hold individual cities and towns accountable to a broader set of purposes. Now, one place is Portland. Portland is set up to be able to do that. We have a regional government, a directly elected regional government. It's the only one in the United States. And it has the ability to require local governments to make their plans consistent with regional plans. That's a huge power. And in some parts of the country, there is interest in that idea. I mean, there's interest in that idea in Seattle and in Minneapolis and maybe a few other places. But I would say in a majority of the United States, there's no interest at all. And, you know, maybe there is kind of some interest in coordinating. Yeah, in fact, I think coordination is kind of the key term that's been used for a very long time. Some interest in coordinating maybe investments in infrastructure like sewage systems and water systems, maybe to some degree, some aspects of transportation systems. But when you come right down to it, there's very limited interest across the United States among jurisdictions in really finding new ways to become accountable to larger purposes. And that's the key. It's a governance issue. It's an institutional issue. I think it's a fundamental challenge to kind of the idea of regionalism and regions in the first place, which is why I think the mega-regional kind of effort has really focused in many ways on the nation scale, on a national level assessment and then effort, because unless and until the national government begins to expect local accountability to regional aims, we're just not going to see much of it. So I wish I could, I'm an optimist. I wish I could be more optimistic about our ability to do what you describe, but I think it's a very, very difficult task.
Thank you so much for this answer. But just further questions about the things you said is, you mentioned that there is an Oregon regional plan, and you mean not only the Portland, but the surrounding cities just follow these plans, and these plans have a really big power to guide the cities. But I'm thinking, so, you know, there was a city besides Portland called Vancouver, Washington State. Yeah. So could these plans cover that city since they are in different states?
Yeah, really good question. Our regional government does not include Vancouver, Washington, despite the fact that Vancouver, Washington is within our metropolitan region. However, there is a lot of cooperation, there's a lot of communication across that state boundary, but in the end, the state boundary is more powerful than the regional idea, at least at this time. I should say one thing that helps us in many ways is that Vancouver, Washington, and Southwest Washington generally is kind of the forgotten quarter of Washington State. You know, most of the political power and economic power in Washington State is either in the Puget Sound region where Seattle is, or in Spokane and, you know, the eastern side of the state. And so in many ways, Vancouver is kind of regarded by Washington as part of Oregon anyhow, you know? They're not given the same kind of place at the table in a lot of ways, which I think makes them more likely to seek cooperation south of the border than they might ordinarily be.
Definitely, especially thinking about there was no like the income tax in Washington State, but
That's
no
right.
sales tax in Portland. That could be the ideal place to live.
Oh, in fact, periodically the Washington State Police set up cordons and stop people coming north into Washington with Washington license plates to see if they've paid sales tax on whatever it is they're bringing back.
Thanks
That's
for the
interesting.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that sounds like in New England, right? New Hampshire does not have sales tax, and Massachusetts has a
Right.
quite high tax. So lots of people choose to buy homes, live in New Hampshire, buy cars, and then commute to Boston for work.
Right. Well, you know, it's like Portland is the only bi-state metropolitan region in the West. You know, all the rest of the metropolitan regions are really within states, with the exception of San Diego and Tijuana, which is binational. Yeah, I mean, you know, to a certain degree, we can, you know, Portland can offer businesses or households the choice of tax systems. You can live in the same metropolitan area and live under different tax systems for what that's worth. But I think it raises a really interesting question about some of these megaregion derivations, which is, you know, at what point is a megaregion a state? So for example, the Arizona Sun Corridor, if you look at the literature on megaregions, I mean, it's solely within Arizona. It encompasses almost all of the economic activity within the state of Arizona. It encompasses almost all of the growth within the state of Arizona. So, you know, what are we talking about? Is this a mega region or is it just simply the state of Arizona?
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, when you look at a number of the mega regions, the Texas Triangle, another example, you know, I mean, how much of Texas's economy is within the Texas Triangle? You know, at what point is, I mean, is there really a Texas Triangle, or is that just kind of a map maker's fiction, right? And, you know, so I think we need to kind of look carefully at what we're using this term to describe. May not be useful to use it in such a ubiquitous way. It may make it less specific and therefore less useful as time goes by.
Thank you. And any other questions from the audience? Nafisa.
Yeah. Thank you so much. First of all, like, it's really a fascinating presentation. I think what I'm interested more, as you mentioned, like the Cascadia is very unique, like because it's trying to like preserve like the natural landscapes and like move away from the continuity of like urbanization. And I think like a lot of, in many ways, like a lot of opposition regarding to this kind of like green initiative. Like, for example, the carbon tax controversy. Like, I just want to like know further, like, can you elaborate more like how this green initiative can play out in Cascadia region without like hurting economies, particularly like the low income communities?
Sure. So, you know, if you ask people in most of these places around here why they like living in their community, they say, well, they like their neighborhood, but, you know, they like being close to the ocean and close to the mountains and that they can get out of the city quickly. So there's I think an extra jurisdictional sense of quality of life, you know. And it's true, you know, on the horizon, there are snow-capped mountains, you know, the weather and the changes in the weather bring with them kind of literally the scent of the ocean. I mean, I think we're reminded in a lot of ways over and over again that we're within a bigger region, a bigger landscape that has offered us a tremendous number of opportunities, kind of over the years. There's a kind of a seasonal cycle associated with, what grows here and what lives here and what moves through here, that whether it's blue collar, white collar, kind of in the city or in the country, people are aware of this and have access to it. It's kind of interesting. Oregon is, 52% of the state of Oregon is owned by the federal government. So we have a tremendous amount of public land around us. And if you go out to, kind of areas outside our metropolitan area, during certain kinds of fishing seasons, you'll be surrounded by Russian immigrants and Vietnamese and Hispanic and African-American fishermen. It's more diverse on the sides of the rivers than it often is within the neighborhoods of the city, which is quite interesting to me. So I think there's a tangible kind of presence of the landscape in the way these places are kind of organized. And at the same time, I think that the question you're raising is a really good one. To a certain degree, you got to have a car and you've got to have a job, and you've got to be able to participate in the economy. You've got to feel safe, when you go out to these places. And I would say that we are not immune to either the issues of race and class that permeate this nation, or to the heightened concern that I think is evident in the nation right now. So in other words, we're not insulated from Fox News, or from or from MSNBC for that matter. I mean, whatever is affecting people's attitudes about their power or efficacy in their communities nationally is affecting the way people feel about it here. So we're by no means, immune from that or insulated from that. And I would say those issues are huge for us. Those are very, very difficult. And I wish I could tell you, for example, one of the things that's quite interesting in Portland is there's been a lot of work on equity and planning. The city has done a tremendous amount of work on equity. But, a lot of the equity work to date has really focused on process. How do we engage people? How do we give people a place at the table, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. We have yet to really construct, I think, a vision of what an equitable city looks like. Now, it might look just the way this city looks today, the shape of the city doesn't change, and but it's just maybe the attitudes of people within the city that have to change. Or maybe actually, these cities are designed in certain ways that reinforce certain attitudes, and we need to redesign the city to take that set of incentives away from attitudes that enable people to resort to racism or sexism or classism or any other thing like that. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of this work is in process. I don't think we've figured it all out, but I think that's what you're going to do, and I think that's what's going to happen with the next crop of graduates. When you guys go into practice, it's going to be, you will be joining this profession and these activities for planning locally, regionally, nationally at a very dynamic time. I hope.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other question? Maybe last one. not, then we are approaching the time. Well, thank you again very much, Professor Seltzer, for this guest lecture. Aside from the background information and the work done by Professor Seltzer and his team about Cascadia, I think Professor Seltzer's talk really encouraged us to step back and think. Really, those I think that those questions about megaregions, really why or how megaregion matter, and does megaregion lead to better planning or not? Does megaregion lead to a better outcome? So those general questions about megaregion, the discourse of megaregion discussion, I think really deserve second, third thought when we work on our own megaregions. So it's not just for the sake of it's a bigger area that we should look into that, but rather the ways that we make plans, so we suggest policies that really eventually will lead to a better outcome of all the locations, localities, and the population groups. So I think that's the end outcome. And then megaregions, when we look at that, not necessarily just look at the economic or physical, morphological proximity or adjacency, but also we should look at ties beyond the physical economic aspect, for example, the ecological traditions and the culture background. So really very thought-provoking talk. Thank you again. So I guess we will see you, hope to see you in some other
Thank you.
time, locations in person in the near future.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
Good to see you.